I stood frozen at the threshold of my sanctuary, my withered hand gripping the oak doorframe, worn smooth by the passage of decades. In this house, this room had been my altar, the only place where I could still feel the lingering warmth of George after 40 years together. But now, that warmth was suffocating, replaced by the musky, pungent odor of animal fur and the sharp sting of betrayal. There, on the premium memory foam mattress George and I had scrimped and saved for during our early years, lay Daisy. The golden retriever was sprawled insolently, occupying the exact center of the lavender sheets I had pressed crisp just this morning. Her snoring was steady, rhythmic, and utterly indifferent, as if she were the rightful master of this room. And worse yet, my hand-embroidered pillow, the last physical link to George's scent, lay discarded on the floor like a piece of refuse. "Mom, Daisy's joints are failing. She needs a softer place to stay warm. You know how these breeds get with arthritis as they age." Andrew's voice drifted in from behind, monotone and clinical, devoid of empathy. He stood with arms folded, his face gleaming under the hallway lights, watching me as if I were a piece of outdated furniture taking up space. His eyes held nothing of the boy who once wailed when he saw me nick my finger. Now, in his world, a dog's comfort carried more weight than the dignity of the mother who gave him life. I didn't answer immediately. As a former nurse with 5 years in the ER before retiring to raise a family, I had learned to keep my heart rate steady in the most dire situations. I drew a breath, feeling my alveoli expand. But an instant, familiar itch began to claw at the back of my throat. Dog dander. Andrew knew. He knew my history of asthma, my violent allergy to animal epithelium. When George was alive, Daisy wasn't allowed to cross the threshold, let alone claim the bed. This wasn't just an insult. It was a biological assault on my respiratory system. "It's just safer for you, Eleanor. We've moved your things to the room by the laundry. It's closer to the bath. No stairs to climb. It's for the best." Sharon Andrews' wife stepped out from the living room, her eyes never leaving her glowing phone screen. She called me by my first name, an impertinence Andrew never dared to correct. The word safer escaped her lips like a sentence. In medicine, we called it isolation. They didn't want to care for me. They wanted to tuck me into a dark corner where the sight of my aging wouldn't trigger their guilt. I looked down at my hands, thin skin draped over blue veins like parchment. I could have screamed. I could have reminded them whose nursing salary and whose husband's pension paid for every brick of this house. But looking at them was like pouring water into a shattered vessel. Their greed had lobotomized their conscience. I knelt and retrieved my pillow from the floor. The silk was matted with hair and dust. By professional instinct, I noticed small red pustules on Daisy's underbelly as she shifted. The dog was suffering from pyoderma, or parasites. Sharon's insistence on keeping her here, in the place where I laid my head every night, was a calculated act of cruelty. She wanted me to fall ill. A fragile old woman in the throes of an asthma attack is an easier sell for a nursing home than a clear-headed one. "Fine," I said, my voice raspy but unshaken. "If you believe this is best." Andrew exhaled a sound of profound, selfish relief. He thought I had buckled. He didn't realize that when a nurse goes silent, she is simply reviewing the chart before the intervention begins. I clutched the soiled pillow and turned toward the stairs leading to the storage closet by the laundry room. With every step, I felt my chest tighten bronchospasm, the first stage of the allergic reaction. I didn't cough. I began the 4-7-8 breathing rhythm I had taught 1,000 patients. Reaching the ground floor, the smell of cheap detergent and rising damp hit me. The storage room was once a graveyard for old cardboard boxes and broken machinery. Now, it held a rickety twin bed with sheets so thin they felt cold. The fluorescent tube on the ceiling flickered, bathing the space in the sickly green light of a morgue. I placed the pillow on the bed and looked at my reflection in a cracked mirror on the wall. Sharon thinks she is clever. She thinks environmental triggers and malnutrition will break me. She forgot that before I was a burden, I stood for 24-hour shifts in the blood and the tears, holding back death with nothing but a syringe and a steady hand. My fingers found the small vial of antihistamines in my sweater pocket. I didn't take one yet. I needed to stay sharp. Above, Sharon's laughter rang out, followed by Daisy's playful bark. They were celebrating their first victory. They didn't know that in the shadows of the laundry room, the mother they considered senile was beginning a precise diagnosis of their rot. I will not die in this closet. I will use the medical wisdom of a lifetime to build a fortress they cannot breach. Andrew may be brainwashed, but his blood is my blood, and I will treat him no matter how painful the surgery. That night, I lay on the twin bed, listening to the washing machine groan through its cycle. The sound was like the heartbeat of a dying house. I closed my eyes and visualized my immune cells standing to attention. I am Eleanor, and this is only the beginning of the fight for my bed, or more accurately, the fight for my humanity. The thin wooden door of the storage room groaned shut with a dry, hollow click, echoing through the desolate silence of the ground floor. I stood paralyzed between 4 narrow walls, clutching my silk pillow to my chest like a final, desperate shield. Above me, the fluorescent tube flickered violently before blooming into a cold, clinical white glare, exposing the naked reality of what Sharon called my safe space. This room was nothing more than a logistical afterthought, wedged between the noisy hum of the laundry room and the drafty passage to the garage. The air hung thick and heavy, a nauseating cocktail of industrial detergent and the damp, stagnant breath of walls that had forgotten the touch of sunlight. Having spent thousands of hours in hospital corridors, my sensitivity to scent had become extreme. With one shallow breath, I identified the enemy, mold spores silently blooming in the shadows. To a woman with sensitive lungs and a history of allergies, this was no bedroom. It was a biological snare. I listened to the retreating rhythm of Andrew and Sharon's footsteps on the wooden stairs. Then, their muffled whispers began to drift down through the aging ventilation slats. I moved silently to the wall, pressing my ear against the thin drywall. "See, Andrew?" She didn't even react. "That's exactly the sundowning I told you about." Sharon's voice floated down, honeyed, but laced with venom. Once evening hits, she gets lethargic, disoriented. Keeping her on the second floor with that steep staircase is a legal liability for us. Down there, next to the laundry, we can hear her if she falls or wanders off. But Sharon, it's a closet. Mom didn't look well. Andrew's voice was hesitant, but pathetically weak. That's exactly why she needs close supervision. Don't you get it? People with late-day confusion tend to get agitated or roam. Being near the exit is best for care, and for an ambulance, if it comes to that. I closed my eyes, a shudder rippling down my spine. Sundowning. Sharon was brilliant, weaponizing medical terminology to label the collapse she was actively engineering. In my world, we used that term to describe the increased confusion of dementia patients as the sun set. By planting the seed of my cognitive decline in Andrew's mind, she was prepping the file to discard me into a cheap nursing home without a whisper of resistance from my own son. I released the pillow, placing it on the rickety twin bed they had provided. The synthetic sheets felt abrasive, instantly irritating my skin. I began to scan the room with the eyes of a head nurse, inspecting a potential site of infection. In the corner behind the washing machine, a black bloom of mold flourished. Fueled by the constant humidity of the dryers next door, this room was a perfect incubator for respiratory irritants. They knew I had asthma. They knew Daisy's dander on my old bed had already primed my immune system. And now, they were doubling down with mold and caustic chemicals. My chest began to feel heavy, the familiar, tightening grip of bronchospasms as my airways constricted to keep the invaders out. If I coughed, if I struggled for breath, Sharon would instantly call Andrew and say, "See? She's too weak to breathe on her own." I would not give them the satisfaction. I opened my old handbag and retrieved a small bottle of saline. I dampened my white silk handkerchief and pressed it firmly over my nose and mouth, the most primitive air filter, a trick from the years when outbreaks swept the city. My breathing became deliberate, controlled. I refused to let it become shallow or frantic, the hallmark of a patient spiraling into panic. I focused on my diaphragm, forcing the air deep, filtering it through the damp silk to neutralize the lurking spores. I sat on the edge of the mattress, feeling the floor shudder as the washing machine entered its spin cycle. This noise, this vibration, it was designed to ensure sleep deprivation. Prolonged insomnia leads to cognitive impairment, creating that very look of lethargy and fatigue Sharon so desperately needed to prove her sundowning theory. "Mom? You okay in there?" Andrew's voice came from behind the door. He didn't enter. He just shouted through the crack, as if afraid of contagion. I lowered the handkerchief, smoothed my silver hair, and answered in a voice as level as a horizon line, even though every word made my lungs scream in protest. "I'm fine, Andrew. Just organizing a few things." "Right. Get some rest. Sharon says you need more sleep at night to stay. You know, to keep your mind sharp." I smiled bitterly in the dark. My mind had never been sharper. While Andrew was blinded by his wife's sugar-coated lies, I was sitting in my prison, dissecting their every move. I stood and approached the room's only window, a small pane high near the ceiling, jammed shut by layers of old paint. I took a nail file from my bag and began to meticulously scrape away the dried crust. My hands shook from the exertion, but I didn't stop. After 10 minutes, the window creaked open, admitting a sharp, cold draft of night air. That rush of oxygen was a resurrection. I stood there, drinking in the wind, feeling the constriction in my chest slowly uncoil. This was a war of attrition. Sharon wanted to use this environment to degrade my body, but I would use my knowledge of hygiene and epidemiology to turn this closet into a fortress. I began to clean. I used damp cloths to trap the dust, blocking the gaps under the door to keep out the chemical fumes. I couldn't change the room's location, but I could control the air I breathed. That night, I lay down but did not sleep. I listened to the house whose every breath I knew by heart. I heard Daisy's paws clicking on the floorboards directly above my head, a constant reminder of the squatter in my bed. I heard Sharon's trilling laugh, and the muffled pop of champagne as Andrew opened a bottle in the living room. They were celebrating the solution to the Eleanor problem. In the darkness, I reached out and took my own pulse. 72 beats per minute, steady, resolute. It was the heart rate of a woman prepared for a major surgery. I was not confused. I was not weak. And I was certainly not a sundowning patient. I am a nurse, and the best nurses know exactly how to survive the harshest conditions, waiting for the moment when the patient, or in this case, the traitors, shows the final symptom of their own rot. "Good night, George," I whispered into the void, hugging the pillow to my chest. I'm still standing. Our home. I'm still here to protect it. The washing machine next door suddenly cut out, leaving behind a terrifying silence. I knew the battle had only just begun, and this storage room was not where I would end my life. It was where I was sharpening my mind for a counterattack they would never see coming. The next morning, a frail sunlight struggled to pierce through the small window I had pried open the night before. I woke with a parched throat, but my chest felt lighter, eased by the natural flow of air. The distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen signaled the start of a new day in a house where I was now merely an unofficial inhabitant. I smoothed the wrinkles of my wool cardigan, composing myself before stepping out of the storage room. There stood Toby, my 7-year-old grandson, clutching a soccer ball in the hallway. His eyes, usually clear and bright, suddenly clouded with hesitation when he saw me. The eager spark of a boy waiting for his grandmother's stories had been replaced by a guarded, almost fearful distance. "Toby, come here to Grandma," I called softly, offering a smile I hoped was warm enough to thaw this strange, icy atmosphere. The boy took a sharp step back. The ball slipped from his hands, rolling toward my feet. He stared at it as if the object had become tainted just by touching the space around me. At that exact moment, Sharon swept into the hallway like a hawk, snatching Toby back behind her. "Toby, what did I tell you? Stay away from that area," she snapped, her eyes darting toward me with sharp suspicion. "But it's just Grandma, Mommy," Toby whispered. "Listen to me." Sharon knelt, her voice intentionally low but articulated clearly enough for me to catch every syllable. "Grandma isn't well. Old people carry very specific types of bacteria germs that a child's immune system just can't fight. I don't want you catching those toxins and getting sick. Do you understand?" I stood frozen. Toxins? Specific bacteria? As a nurse, I recognized exactly what Sharon was doing. This wasn't just a lie. She was weaponizing a child's medical ignorance to sow seeds of terror. She was transforming me into a biological hazard in the eyes of my own grandson. In behavioral psychology, this is the first stage of total isolation, making the target repulsive, even to those who love them most, by exploiting basic survival instincts. "Sharon, I do not have a contagious disease. You know that perfectly well," I said calmly, meeting her gaze. Sharon straightened up, a hollow, performative smile stretching across her face. "Oh, Eleanor, we all know that at your age, the body loses its ability to stay clean. Studies talk about how the elderly accumulate latent pathogens. We're just protecting Toby. Safety first, right?" She led Toby upstairs without another word, leaving me alone in the cold hallway. I watched Toby's small shadow disappear, a sharp ache in my heart as the boy stole one last confused look back at me. He was being programmed to believe his grandmother was a source of filth. I retreated to the storage room. The air still held the ghost of detergent and dampness. I understood then that words alone would never reach Toby. He would always believe his mother. Children don't trust abstract theories. They trust what they see, smell, and feel. If Sharon insisted my room was a den of germs and squalor, I would make it the most pristine sanctuary in the house. I began a total decontamination without using Sharon's pungent, caustic cleaners. I knew that chlorine bleach would only irritate my lungs and create a terrifying hospital atmosphere. Instead, I relied on the most fundamental principles of epidemiology. I used white vinegar diluted with water and a few drops of lemongrass oil I had secretly kept in my suitcase. Vinegar is a magnificent natural antiseptic. It breaks down the structure of mold without leaving a toxic chemical trail. I knelt on the floor, scrubbing every tile gap and every dark corner where the black mold lurked. My hands grew weary, and my aging back throbbed with sharp protests. But I didn't stop. Every stain erased was a reclamation of my dignity. I hauled the rotting cardboard boxes out to the garage, clearing the space for air to circulate. I polished the small window until it was crystal clear, allowing the sunlight to flood in and destroy anaerobic bacteria. In medicine, sunlight is the finest, most cost-effective disinfectant there is. By late afternoon, the dismal storage room had been resurrected. It was no longer a damp cave. It was bright, carrying the crisp scent of lemongrass and the dry warmth of the sun. I placed a few of George's old books on a small, polished wooden table. The space now possessed a strange, orderly peace. When Andrew returned from work, Toby was playing near the basement stairs. The boy seemed drawn to the pleasant aroma wafting from below. "Mommy, what's that smell? It smells good," Toby asked as Sharon walked down. Sharon frowned, descending the stairs with the intent of finding a flaw to reprimand me for. But as she reached the door, she stopped short. Her face contorted into a mix of bewilderment and irritation. The room was neither cluttered nor foul. On the contrary, it was surgically clean, yet unexpectedly cozy. "What do you think you're doing? Where did you get all this?" Sharon demanded, eyeing the small bottle of essential oil on the table. "I am simply sanitizing my living quarters, Sharon. As a nurse, I cannot abide unhygienic conditions," I replied steadily, smoothing a handkerchief. Toby peered curiously through the doorway. He looked around, seeing that Grandma's room was cleaner and smelled better than the dog hair-filled living room upstairs. The fear in his eyes began to waver. He saw his grandmother was still poised and clean, and her room held nothing of the toxic world his mother had described. "Grandma, your room smells so good. Not like Mommy's medicine," Toby blurted out. Sharon gritted her teeth, grabbing Toby's arm. "That's just on the surface. Sweetie, you can't see bacteria with your eyes. Upstairs. Now!" I watched them leave. My heart felt lighter yet heavy with the task ahead. I had won the battle of the senses for Toby's trust, but Sharon's brainwashing of Andrew was far more insidious. I sat on my twin bed, wrapped in the comfort of my own cleanliness. Sharon thought she could use distorted medical terms to turn me into a pariah. She didn't realize that a woman who once managed an entire intensive care unit knows exactly how to keep her safe zone from being breached. Late that night, Toby snuck down. He stood at the door, tossed a chocolate bar onto my bed, and vanished back into the shadows. I held the candy in my hand, tears stinging my eyes. The child had begun to doubt the lies. Medical truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to exist with transparency and grace. I knew this war would be long. Sharon wouldn't stop at germs. She would attack my mind, my lucidity. But looking at my improvised sterile ward, I knew I was ready. I don't have an old woman's infirmity. I have the resilience of a woman who spent her life caring for others. And now, I am caring for my own truth. Breakfast began with a dull, hollow thud on the wooden table of my storage room. Sharon set down a cheap plastic tray, bearing a processed sausage sandwich wrapped in grease-stained paper and a glass of bottled orange juice with an unnervingly vibrant yellow hue. She refused to meet my eyes, standing at the door while she adjusted her new designer dress purchased, I presumed, with my own credit card. Eat up, Eleanor. Fast food is easier for everyone. We're too busy to spend all day in the kitchen cooking elaborate meals for the elderly, Sharon said, her voice high-pitched and dripping with false charity. I looked down at the tray. Having managed thousands of hospital meal plans during my years as a nurse, I didn't need a laboratory to know what this contained. That bleached white bread was a hollow block of starch, packed with enough preservatives to last a month. But the real danger lurked in the juice and the condiments. I could smell the heavy synthetic flavorings and the cloying scent of high-fructose corn syrup, a cheap industrial sugar. Sharon was systematically pumping into my system. I picked up the sandwich, feigning a bite while meticulously observing its texture. In medicine, we understand the profound link between the gut and the brain. A diet overloaded with artificial sugars and saturated fats triggers silent inflammatory responses, leading to what we call brain fog. Sharon didn't want me dead immediately. She wanted me lethargic, dim-witted, forgetful, and exhausted. She wanted to transform her lies about my dementia into a visible reality for Andrew to witness. What's the matter? Not to your taste? Or have you forgotten how to chew? Sharon smirked, her eyes searching for a sign of weakness. I blinked slowly, letting my shoulders slump, and met her gaze with the vacuous stare of a patient lost in thought. Oh, no, I'm eating. Thank you, Sharon. I took a small bite, forcing myself to swallow the mealy, flavorless paste. Satisfied, Sharon turned away. The rhythmic clack-clack of her heels on the floorboards above signaled another minor victory for her. The moment her shadow vanished, I spat the mouthful into a tissue and tucked it under the bed frame. I poured the chemical orange juice into the laundry sink, watching the neon liquid swirl down the drain. I knew that if I continued to ingest what she provided, my brain would soon become the sludge she expected. At 78, my liver and kidneys had less margin for error. I couldn't afford to waste my vitality on poison. I moved to the darkest corner of the room, behind the stack of old towels I had rearranged the day before. Inside a vintage sewing tin, I retrieved a cache of almonds, walnuts, and several high-potency blisters of omega-3 and vitamin B12. These were the supplies I had secretly commissioned from the postman, using the small emergency fund George had always insisted I keep hidden. I chewed a walnut slowly, savoring the rich, earthy, fat-clean fuel for my cells. Omega-3 was the raw material for repairing neuronal membranes, and B12 was the key to keeping the brain's electrical signaling uninterrupted. While Sharon attempted to sabotage my cognition with sugar and grease, I was quietly fortifying my intellectual fortress with the purest nutrients. That afternoon, Andrew came down to see me. He looked haggard, his eyes shadowed by debt and the relentless pressure Sharon heaped upon him. He sat on the lone wooden chair, watching me as I stared blankly at the wall. "Mom, how are you feeling?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't answer right away. I let a long silence hang between us, long enough for him to feel the distance. Then, I turned to him, letting my eyes go slightly glassy, my voice a frail whisper. "Andrew, dear, I meant to ask you something, but it's just slipped my mind. I think I wanted to ask about George?" I saw a flash of relief, a sickening, desperate relief flicker in my son's eyes. He thought Sharon's diet was working. He believed I had truly begun the long slide into the darkness of forgetting. "Dad passed away a long time ago, Mom." "You forgot again." Andrew sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Sharon's right. You need more specialized rest. Maybe a place with doctors on staff 24/7. Is that so, son?" "I suppose I really am getting old," I murmured, my hand trembling as I smoothed my skirt. Inside me, a cold fire roared. Andrew, the child I had labored to bring into this world, was rooting for his mother's decline just to ease the burden on his conscience. He had no idea that behind the fog I was performing, my brain was operating at peak efficiency. Thanks to the omega-3 and my absolute focus, I memorized every twitch of his face, every shift in his breathing. I noted the signs of severe stress in him. The way his temporal arteries throbbed suggested his blood pressure was reaching a dangerous threshold. The moment Andrew left, I straightened my spine. My eyes sharpened into those of a head nurse preparing for the most critical surgery of her life. I pulled a small notebook from under the mattress and made an entry. Day 12. Andrew has fully accepted the dementia narrative. Sharon has increased the use of artificial sweeteners in food. Personal health, stable. Neurological reflexes, sharp. I wasn't just surviving. I was compiling the medical chart of their betrayal. That evening, Sharon brought down a box of fried chicken, glistening with recycled oil. She watched me eat with a triumphant smirk. I pretended to enjoy it, intentionally letting crumbs fall onto my clothes to play the part of a clumsy old woman. Sharon chuckled and went back upstairs. I heard her pick up the phone, likely calling a nursing home broker. "Yes, she's much worse than I thought. Get the paperwork ready as soon as possible." I sat in the shadows of the storage room, chewing a vitamin B12 tablet and savoring its subtle sweetness. Sharon thought she was playing a game of chess against a senile old lady. She had no idea she was facing an ER nurse with 5 years of experience dealing with the most cunning manipulators and delusional patients. My intellect was not fading. On the contrary, it was being honed by their cruelty. They wanted a hollow shell? Fine, I would give them a shell that observes, remembers, and knows exactly how to excise a malignant tumor from this family when the time is right. My house, my bed, and my life. I would reclaim them all through the very lucidity they were trying to extinguish. Tonight, I slept better than ever, knowing the final move was still mine to make. The doorbell chimed at noon, piercing through the stagnant air and the heavy scent of dampness that clung to the laundry area. I was seated on the lone wooden chair in the storage room, my frail hands meticulously folding white hand towels. From where I sat, I could hear Sharon rushing to the door, her heels clicking against the floorboards in an excited, staccato rhythm. Here you go, Miss Miller. 3 bags from the mall and a package from the luxury boutique. The delivery driver's voice echoed. Thank you. Just leave them there. I'll handle it, Sharon replied, her voice brimming with a triumph she didn't bother to hide. I stood up, peering through the narrow crack of the door. Sharon was pulling a genuine leather handbag from a paper bag. It was a brilliant crimson, looking like a fresh blood stain under the living room lights. She draped it over her shoulder, admiring herself in the mirror with a satisfied smirk. Then came the silk dresses and expensive cosmetics. A single item among them likely cost half of Andrew's monthly salary. I knew exactly how these were paid for. The high-limit credit card George had left me for medical emergencies was now in Sharon's wallet, being bled dry, cent by cent. In medicine, there is a term: parasite entities that live off the host's nutrients, silently weakening them until nothing remains but a hollow shell. Sharon was the textbook definition of a social parasite. She hadn't just stolen my living space. She was siphoning off the final financial resources that ensured my autonomy. "Mom? Are you in there?" Sharon called out, her voice suddenly curdling into an unnatural sweetness. I retreated to the bed, collapsing back into the persona of a weary old woman. "I'm here, Sharon." She descended the stairs, clutching a pristine white bottle that resembled the high-end supplements advertised on television. She sat beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was physically light but heavy with calculation. "Look, Mom, I've noticed you've been restless lately. I hear you moving around down here every night. I asked a friend in pharmaceuticals to get you these special multivitamins. They're designed to boost memory and help the elderly sleep better. You need to take one right now, then lie down for a bit." She produced a pale blue, oblong tablet. I took the pill, holding it up to eye level. Sharon offered an encouraging smile, but her eyes remained cold and predatory, tracking my every movement with suppressed impatience. Having spent thousands of shifts dispensing medication, I only needed to touch the film coating of this tablet to know something was wrong. It lacked the distinct, slightly yeasty scent of a B-complex vitamin. Instead, it was completely odorless, with a suspiciously smooth surface. Based on the shape and the faint embossed markings on the casing markings, Sharon assumed my eyes were too dim to read. I identified it instantly. This was no vitamin. It was a benzodiazepine, a mild sedative. Sharon didn't want to boost my memory. Quite the opposite. She wanted me in a state of lethargy, suppressing my central nervous system. A grandmother who spent her days nodding off, slow to react and glassy-eyed, would be the living proof she needed for the dementia diagnosis she was desperate to pin on me. Furthermore, while I slept, she would have unfettered access to my finances without the fear of being questioned. "Take it, Mom. Let me get you some water," Sharon said, standing up. Taking advantage of the few seconds her back was turned toward the sink, I swiftly tucked the pill into the narrow gap between the mattress and the wooden bed frame. When she returned with the glass, I feigned the motion of swallowing, took a large gulp of water, and wiped my mouth. "Good girl, Mom. Now lie back and rest. This works quickly," Sharon said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She gave my hand a final, dismissive pat before heading upstairs, taking the plastic tray with my leftover crusts of bread with her. The moment her footsteps faded, I sat bolt upright. The dullness was gone from my eyes. I reached into the gap in the mattress and retrieved the pale blue pill. From beneath the bed, I pulled out a small glass jar that once held ginger candies. Inside were now 3 identical pills she had given me over the past 2 days. In my mind, a clinical file was forming. This was no longer a family dispute. This was evidence of intentional elder abuse and poisoning. In medicine, the dose makes the poison. Forcing a 78-year-old woman to take unprescribed sedatives in a damp, malnourished environment could easily lead to respiratory failure or a fractured hip, the kind of natural deaths no one would question. I took out my small notebook and made a precise entry. Day 15. Subject: Sharon administered a sedative under the guise of a vitamin. Time: 12:45 p.m. Subject's expected symptoms: lethargy, disorientation, reality, medication, confiscated as evidence. I looked out through the crack in the door at the luxury shopping bags strewn across the sofa. Sharon's pragmatism had reached the level of insanity. She was spending the years of hard labor George and I had endured on vanity, while her mother-in-law was shoved into a storage room and drugged into silence. And where was Andrew? Did he know? Or had he been fed a psychological vitamin of his own to keep his eyes closed? I remembered the look in Andrew's eyes whenever he saw me, a cocktail of guilt and a desperate urge to flee. He chose to believe Sharon because it was the path of least resistance. He chose to see me as a burden in need of specialized care, to excuse his own cowardice. I stood up and paced the cramped confines of the storage room to keep my circulation moving. I performed gentle range of motion exercises used in physical therapy. I could not allow my body to atrophy. Every pill I collected was a card I would use to flip the table. That afternoon, Toby snuck down again. He looked at me, seeing me alert and reading an old book, his face twisting in surprise. "Grandma, Mommy said you'd be asleep for a long time after your medicine," Toby whispered. I smiled, beckoning him closer. "I have magic, Toby. I only sleep when I want to." The boy giggled, but then looked up the stairs with a hint of worry. "Mommy bought so many pretty dresses, Grandma. She said they were gifts from you because she works so hard to take care of you. Is that true?" My heart tightened. Sharon was even using Toby to legitimize her theft. "That's right, dear. I always want our family to be happy." I lied, but my hand gripped the jar of pills in my pocket until my knuckles turned white. Pragmatism, under the guise of care, is the most dangerous toxin. It rots trust and turns loved ones into enemies. But Sharon had made a fatal error. She thought that because I was old, I had lost my nursing instincts. She didn't realize that once I held the evidence of her poisoning in my hand, I was no longer a victim. I was the one holding the key to justice. That night, I lay listening to the roar of the washing machine, clutching the small jar. I wouldn't take them. I would keep them, along with the credit card statements I would soon find a way to copy, to prepare for a surgical revelation of the truth. Sharon and Andrew thought they were moving me into a nursing home? No. I was preparing to move them into a court of their own conscience and the law, one they would never escape. Sleep came to me naturally, without the need for chemicals, for my mind was burning with a plan to reclaim my life. The nights in the storage room by the laundry grew eerily quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the dryer and the whistle of the wind through the small window I had managed to pry open. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching the dim slivers of light filtering through the cracks in the floorboards above. Directly over my head was my old bed, the sanctuary I had shared with George, where a dog now lay in my place. But tonight, the sounds from above were not Daisy's usual rhythmic snores. Instead, there was a frantic, persistent scratching, the sound of paws thumping uncontrollably against the wood, and occasional low, broken whimpers. Having spent a lifetime observing the silent signs of a patient's pain, my heart constricted. I knew that sound. It was the sound of madness-inducing itching, of a body being besieged by uninvited guests, invisible to the naked eye. "Shut up, you stupid dog! Lie still!" Sharon's voice barked, followed by a heavy thud against the mattress. "Andrew, look at Daisy. She's scratching all night. I can't sleep. She's probably got mange. Throw her out in the backyard tomorrow. Come on, honey." "She's old and frail," Andrew replied tiredly. "Let her stay on the bed where it's soft." I stood up, threw on a thin cardigan, and slipped quietly up the stairs. I didn't want to confront them, but a nurse's instinct wouldn't allow me to ignore a living being in agony, even if it was the occupant of my bed. I stood in the dark hallway, peering through the cracked door of my former bedroom. Under the dim nightlight, I saw Daisy struggling. She was gnawing at her hind leg until it bled. The once lustrous golden fur was now marred by angry red patches and dry, peeling skin. Sharon sat in an armchair, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at the dog with more disgust than pity. A nurse's eyes never deceive. I saw the tiny, raised papules along the dog's spine, spreading to the thin-skinned areas. My mind immediately recalled lessons on zoonotic diseases, illnesses that jump from animals to humans. This wasn't a simple allergy. Daisy was suffering from a severe parasitic skin infection, likely a fungal infection symbiotic with sarcoptic mange. A chilling realization hit me, nearly causing me to drop my flashlight. Sharon knew. She knew the dog was carrying a pathogen. Her insistence on keeping Daisy on my bed, pressed against the sheets and pillows I still used, wasn't out of love for the animal. She was using Daisy as a biological weapon. She knew my immune system was compromised. She knew my history of asthma and skin allergies. She wanted the infection to jump from the dog to me, to turn me into a festering, foul-smelling, diseased old woman. It was the perfect pretext to ship me off to a facility without anyone daring to intervene. I retreated to the storage room, my heart hammering with indignation. Poor Daisy, she was just another victim in Sharon's ruthless power game. Neglected, left without proper hygiene or medicine, used only as a tool to torment me. The next morning, once Andrew and Sharon had left for work and Toby was at school, I climbed the stairs. Daisy lay panting in the hallway, her eyes cloudy and exhausted as she looked at me. She didn't bark. She only gave a faint, weak wag of her tail. I sat beside her, my thin hands gently hovering over the damaged patches of skin. The dog flinched, then let out a sigh of profound relief as my fingers reached the itchy spots she couldn't scratch herself. "I know it hurts, Daisy," I whispered. "They treat you no better than they treat me." I began my work in silence. I searched through the old first aid kit I had brought down to the basement. Inside, there was still some topical antiseptic and antifungal ointment I used for minor scrapes back at the hospital. I knew human medicine isn't always suitable for canines, but with adjusted dosages and an understanding of active ingredient concentrations, I could soothe her torment. I diluted a saline solution and gently cleansed the bloody sores on Daisy's body. Using a fine-toothed comb, I patiently removed matted fur and the eggs of parasites clinging to her coat. Daisy lay perfectly still, resting her heavy head on my lap, her wheezing breath slowly stabilizing. In that moment, the boundary between human and beast dissolved. We were both outcasts in this home, viewed as burdens and obstacles. I applied a thin layer of ointment to the ulcers. The formula contained anti-itch properties and targeted fungal spores. I did this every day while the house was empty. I sanitized the area where Daisy slept, using a vacuum to clear away infected dander to protect both myself and Toby. One afternoon, Toby came home early and caught me medicating Daisy. He stood by the window, watching in silence. "Grandma. Mommy told me not to touch Daisy. She said she has old person sickness like you," Toby said, his voice laced with worry. I looked at my grandson and gave a reassuring smile. "Daisy doesn't have old person sickness, Toby. She just got bitten by some ants. Grandma is fixing her up so she can play ball with you again." Curiosity got the better of him, and as he saw the dog's relaxed expression, his fear ebbed away. "Perhaps she was just very worried about you," I replied, though my heart ached for the innocence of a child being poisoned by such calculated deceit. After a week, Daisy's transformation was undeniable. The sores began to scab over, and new fur started to cover the bald patches. She began to trot again, and every time she saw me emerge from the storage room, she would rush over to nuzzle my hand in gratitude. The dog that Sharon had intended to be my bane had become my most loyal companion. Sharon seemed baffled by Daisy's recovery without expensive vet bills. She eyed the dog, then looked at me with growing suspicion. "Daisy looks cleaner lately. Have you been bathing her, Andrew?" Sharon asked during dinner. "I've been buried in work, Sharon. I don't have time to wash a dog," Andrew snapped, his eyes glued to a bank statement. Sharon said nothing, but I saw her secretly inspecting the bed. She didn't find the skin flakes or the foul odor she expected would drive me into a sickbed. She had no idea that through silent medical intervention, I had completely neutralized her cruel biological weapon. Daisy now kept watch at the top of the stairs leading to my storage room. She barked an alert whenever Sharon moved suspiciously or when strangers approached. Her presence gave me a strange sense of security amidst the surrounding betrayal. I looked at Daisy, then at my own hands. I never regretted those years as a nurse. That knowledge wasn't just for saving strangers. Now, it was saving an innocent creature and fortifying my own spirit in the fight for my dignity. Sharon wanted me to catch a disease from Daisy? No. She was mistaken. She had unwittingly gifted me a loyal sentry and a living testament to a compassion she could never possess. Tonight, as the washing machine fell silent, I heard a light scratching at the storage room door. I opened it, and Daisy slipped inside, curling up at the foot of my bed. Her warm breath drifted over my aging skin. I stroked her head, feeling the steady heartbeat of my new ally. "Sleep well, Daisy," I whispered. "They were wrong to think we are weak. We will show them the truth soon." Sharon thought she had won when she took my bed. She didn't realize she lost control the moment I laid hands on the dog she intended to harm me with. Intellect and compassion are the two most powerful forms of medicine, and I hold them both. The atmosphere in the house, already suffocating, now seemed to thicken with silent calculations. I sat in my storage room, surrounded by stacks of white towels and the low hum of the dryer. But my hearing reached far beyond these walls. Tonight, the washing machine had finished early, leaving a terrifying silence on the ground floor, and in that silence, the demons in the human heart began to speak. I reached for the small digital voice recorder, a device I'd had the paperboy buy for me a few days ago, and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. I crept toward the stairs, the darkness swallowing my frail frame. From the living room above, Sharon and Andrew's voices drifted down, starting as whispers before hardening into a cold discussion about my future. "Look at her, Andrew. She forgot Toby's name again today." She stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes, just staring at the kettle. "This isn't just old age anymore." Sharon's voice held that professional concern I had heard so often in hospitals. It was the tone used to mask a decision that had already been made. "Maybe she's just tired. It's so noisy and dark down there," Andrew replied, his voice weak, as if he were clutching at the last fraying threads of his conscience. "Don't delude yourself. Those are textbook signs of early onset dementia. Do you want to wait until she accidentally burns the house down or wanders into the street at midnight? I've done the research. Serene Haven on the outskirts has a specialized memory care unit. They have doctors, nurses, and most importantly, she'll finally get some real rest." I gripped the banister. Dementia. Sharon was using the word like a death warrant for my freedom. As a former nurse, I understood the disease intimately, the slow erosion of neurons, the loss of self. But I also knew better than anyone. I didn't have it. Every forgetful moment, every dazed look, had been a performance to see how far they would go. And now, the trap had snapped shut. "But the cost, Sharon," Andrew muttered. "Your mother's savings will cover the first few years. And once we sell this house, think about it, Andrew, your debts will vanish. We can start fresh in a new city. She'll be cared for, and we'll be free. It's the best choice for everyone." The recorder in my pocket whirred silently, capturing every confession of their greed and cruelty. A cold shiver raced down my spine. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted to erase my footprint from this life, to pay off their debts. The next morning, I didn't wait for them to wake. I put on my most formal outfit, pinned my silver hair neatly, and caught the bus to the hospital where I had worked for decades. Entering the lobby, the familiar scent of antiseptic hit me, awakening my nursing instincts. I sought out Dr. Miller, an old colleague who was now the chief of neurology. "Eleanor, it's been ages. What brings you here?" Dr. Miller asked, surprised. I sat across from him, back straight, gaze unwavering. "I want a comprehensive mental status exam, Miller. I want an official MMSE, mini mental state examination, signed and stamped by you." Dr. Miller studied me for a long moment, then nodded. We began. I answered every question on orientation to time and place, performed serial 7s from 100, recalled lists of objects, and copied complex geometric shapes. I did it all with surgical precision, without a second of hesitation. The result was as I expected, 30 over 30. A perfect score that even a younger person might struggle to achieve under stress. "Your mind is as sharp as a scalpel, Eleanor. Not a single sign of cognitive decline," Dr. Miller said, signing the assessment with admiration. "Why do you need this?" "For self-defense, Miller. Against a virus. Not found in any medical textbook," I replied, carefully tucking the document into a folder. I returned home in the late afternoon. Sharon was in the kitchen. She saw me, but didn't ask where I'd been. She likely assumed I'd been wandering aimlessly in my confusion. I quietly went down to the storage room and hid the MMSE results and the recorder in a metal box beneath my mattress. This was my weaponry. On one side, recorded proof of a conspiracy to embezzle and manufacture a diagnosis. On the other, a steel-clad medical certification of my lucidity. Sharon wanted to use medicine to destroy me? I would use medicine to expose the rot in her soul. I sat on my bed and took my own pulse. 70 beats per minute. My heart did not falter. In medicine, we call this homeostasis before a major surgery. I knew that in a few days, when they placed the commitment papers in front of me, the dissection of the truth would begin. That evening, Andrew came down to the storage room. He brought me a glass of warm water, his hand trembling as he offered it. "Mom, drink this. It'll help you sleep. We have a long trip tomorrow. You need your strength." I looked into my son's eyes. They were filled with cowardice. I took the glass, feeling its warmth, but my heart was ice. I knew that in this water lay another sedative to ensure I went quietly into the car tomorrow morning. "Thank you, Andrew. I'll sleep very well," I said, my voice so gentle it made my own skin crawl. The moment he turned away, I poured the water into a gap in the floorboards. I lay down, staring at the dark ceiling. Above me, Daisy was on my bed. Above me, Sharon was dreaming of new dresses and a house without me. They thought I was a 7-8-year-old woman ready for disposal. They had no idea they were facing a nurse who had seen hundreds of people at the edge of death, one who knew exactly how to resurrect dignity from the ashes. Tomorrow morning, the van from the nursing home would arrive. And tomorrow morning, they would realize that the person they intended to lock away was the one holding the noose of justice for their crimes. I closed my eyes, feeling the fire of lucidity in every brain cell. I was ready for the final chapter. The chandelier above cast a sickly, jaundiced glow, trapping the three of us around the oak table. A table that had witnessed decades of warmth, now serving only the bitter chill of betrayal. Sharon sat directly across from me, her blood-red designer handbag perched on the adjacent chair like a trophy of conquest. Beside her, Andrew avoided my gaze, his knuckles white as he white-knuckled the edge of the table. In front of me sat a bowl of thin, translucent soup, what Sharon called senior-appropriate nutrition. I lifted the silver spoon, stirring the watery liquid. The chemical scent of sedatives was more aggressive tonight, a desperate attempt to accelerate my decline. She wanted me incoherent by dawn to ensure I'd be a docile passenger for the 8 a.m. van. "Eleanor," Sharon's voice sliced through the suffocating silence. She slid a thick manila folder toward me. "This is the registration for Serene Haven. We finalized everything. The transport arrives tomorrow. You just need to sign here as the family representative." I didn't sign. I didn't cry. I simply set the spoon down with a deliberate clink and raised my eyes. I watched the confidence falter on her face. She was expecting a breakdown, a plea for mercy, or at the very least, the vacant stare of a woman drugged into submission. Instead, she met the cold, clinical gaze of a head nurse facing a botched code. "Serene Haven?" I repeated. My voice was resonant, devoid of the elderly tremor I'd been faking. "That's an end-stage dementia ward, Sharon. Why would a healthy woman go there?" Mom, don't be difficult. Andrew cut in, his voice a frail reed of cowardice. You're not. You're not sharp anymore. The forgetting, the allergies, the talking to yourself in that closet. You need doctors. I looked at my son, feeling a pang of grief, but my mind remained a sterile operating room. I reached into my vintage handbag and pulled out 2 folders I had meticulously curated. I laid them on the table, overshadowing Sharon's intake forms. This is a formal mini mental state examination, MMSE, from my former hospital, conducted 2 days ago, I said, tapping the 30/30 score, printed in bold. Dr. Miller, the chief of neurology, whom Andrew surely remembers, personally signed this. It confirms I am fully lucid. No dementia, no sundowning syndrome, nothing but absolute clarity. Sharon's face went ashen. She lunged for the paper, but I was faster, flipping open the second folder. And this, I continued, my voice hardening into steel, is a 2-month history of my credit card statements. 15 luxury purchases, bags, cosmetics, all processed while I was locked in a storage room. And here, I held up a small glass jar, are the pills you've been feeding me as vitamins. In my profession, we call this systematic poisoning, with benzodiazepines, to induce pseudo-dementia symptoms. The room plunged into a deafening silence. Andrew stared at his wife, then at the financial records. Beads of sweat broke out on his forehead. Andrew, my son. I turned to him, my tone as objective as a clinical diagnosis. Have you noticed your own fatigue? Your racing heart and rising blood pressure every time Sharon presents a new debt? That isn't stress. It's manipulation. She fed you the narrative that I was a burden, a patient, just so she could bleed dry the legacy George worked his life to leave me. Sharon, what is this? Andrew stammered, his hands shaking as he grabbed the bank statement. A red handbag? Luxury skincare? You said these were gifts from Mom. You believe her? Sharon shrieked, her curated beauty contorting into a mask of rage. She's a senile old woman. Those papers are forgeries. She's trying to destroy us. Silence. I slammed my hand onto the oak. The sharp crack echoed, muzzling her instantly. In that moment, the closet-dwelling grandmother vanished. The head nurse took the floor. As a nurse, I've spent half my life observing symptoms. And yours, Sharon, are pathological greed and a total deficit of human ethics. You intentionally put an infected dog on my bed to trigger my asthma. You cut my protein intake to induce physical wasting. In a court of law, this is called elder abuse and intentional battery. Andrew buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving. My God! Mom! I didn't know. I really didn't know she went this far. You didn't know because you chose the comfort of ignorance, Andrew, I said, the disappointment flavoring my words. Your apathy was her accomplice. You watched me wither in a laundry room while the dog took my bed, and you told yourself it was just old age. I stood up, feeling tall and commanding under the yellow light. I took the nursing home application and shredded it, the white scraps fluttering down into Sharon's drugged soup like ash. Tomorrow there will be no van, I declared. The only person leaving this house is you, Sharon. I have a fraud report and abuse evidence ready for the authorities. Andrew, you have a choice. Stand with the truth and help me clean this rot, or face the police by her side. Sharon lunged at me, but Andrew was up in a flash, shoving her back. For the first time in years, I saw George's fire in his eyes, a righteous, overdue fury. "Enough, Sharon," he roared. "Get out. Get out now." I gathered my files and walked out of the dining room. Behind me, Sharon's hysterics faded into background noise. I walked straight toward the stairs to my storage room. In my clean sanctuary, smelling of lemongrass and victory, Daisy was waiting. She wagged her tail, her eyes bright and healthy. I sat on my bed and checked my own pulse. 80 beats per minute. Slightly elevated. But it was the rhythm of life, of justice, finally administered. I looked into the small mirror and saw a woman who refused to be discarded. I had just performed the most brutal psychological surgery of my life, but it was necessary to excise the malignancy eating this family. Sharon thought medicine was a weapon to bury me. She was wrong. Medicine is the tool of truth. That night, for the first time in months, I breathed deep. Not because the air had changed, but because the weight of my son's weakness and my daughter-in-law's malice had been lifted. The confrontation at the table wasn't just a reversal of fortune. It was the return of the head nurse, the woman who knows exactly how to keep her medical chart clean until the very last breath. The dining room, once a suffocating cage of silence, shattered under the weight of Sharon's screams. She was no longer the poised woman in silk. Her face was a distorted mask, eyes mapped with red veins of fury and terror as the layers of her deception were peeled back like necrotic skin. Andrew collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with a violent tremor. It looked like a surgical theater where the patient had just been told the tumor was terminal. "You're insane. You're a senile, raving lunatic," Sharon shrieked, her manicured finger trembling as she pointed it at my face. "Those files are fakes. You're using this poor old woman act to manipulate everyone. Andrew, don't you see? She's punishing us for the dog, for that basement. She's delusional." I stood before her, my frame thin but anchored like an ancient oak against a gale. 5 years in the ER, facing delirious patients and personality disorders, had hardened my pulse. I didn't let her insults graze my heart rate. Instead, I clinically observed her. Dilated pupils, rapid and shallow respiration, involuntary facial tics, classic signs of a complete psychological collapse. "Sharon," I said, my voice low and rhythmic, the tone a doctor uses to stabilize a patient in crisis. "You can call me whatever you like, but bank records and central hospital certifications do not have a creative imagination. In medicine, we don't diagnose based on emotions. We rely on clinical evidence." "Evidence? You're just a rotting relic who should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." I took a step toward her, unwavering. "You're right. I am old. But I am an old woman who has spent thousands of hours triaging what can be saved and what must be excised to keep the body alive. In my years as a nurse, I've seen many tumors. Some are benign, others are malignant. They creep in silently, siphoning nutrients, destroying the host from within." I paused, locking my eyes onto her flickering gaze. "Sharon, you are the malignancy in this family. You infiltrated Andrew's life, drained his conscience, sowed poison in Toby's soul, and tried to eliminate the woman who built the very foundation of this house. As a nurse, I know when a wound can no longer be healed with a bandage. The only way to save the rest of the body is to cut out the necrosis. Sharon lunged, but Andrew moved faster. He stood between us, his eyes bloodshot with a mixture of agony and sudden, piercing lucidity. The fog Sharon had spent years cultivating around him had finally burned away. "Sharon, shut your mouth," Andrew barked, his voice raw. "I heard it. I heard every word on that recorder. You wanted to exile my mother to steal this house? You lied to me to pay for your vanity?" "Andrew, let me explain," she staged. "Get out." Andrew pointed a shaking hand toward the door. "Not another word. My mother saved lives, while you were killing her every day with those goddamn pills." Sharon froze. Her face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent white as she realized her last ally was gone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a final sheet of paper, not a medical chart, but a legal ultimatum I had prepared with George's lawyer. "This is your discharge, Sharon," I said, placing the paper on the table. "Two conditions. 1. You leave this house immediately with nothing but your clothes. 2. You sign this agreement to repay every cent stolen from my accounts over the next 2 years. If you sign, I withhold the reports for elder abuse and financial fraud from the police. If you stay 10 more minutes, I call the private investigator I hired to track your luxury shipments." A heavy, absolute silence descended. Sharon looked at the paper, then at Andrew, who stood like a statue of stone. She realized her clinical trial was over. There is no manipulating a mother who holds all the evidence. Without a word, she turned and fled upstairs. The sound of a suitcase dragging across the floorboards echoed a bitter, hollow sound. 10 minutes later, she descended, her face a cold, resentful mask, and vanished through the front door. The slam of the wood was the final gunshot of a long, exhausting war. Andrew sank to the floor, resting his head against my knees, sobbing like a lost child. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I was so blind. I let her hurt you." I lifted my thin, weathered hand and stroked his hair. In medicine, after a major excision, the body often enters a state of shock and intense pain before recovery begins. Andrew was there now, in the middle of a painful but necessary cleansing of the soul. "Stand up, son," I whispered. "We have work to do. This house needs to be decontaminated. Not just the mold in the basement, but the lies that have haunted these halls." I helped him to his feet. Watching him crumble, I felt no thrill of victory, only a profound, quiet relief. I had delivered my verdict not out of spite, but out of the duty of a mother and a nurse. I had cut out the tumor to save what was left of my son's humanity. I looked back at the table. The MMSE scores, the pill bottles, the bank records. They weren't just papers. They were the shield that had kept my dignity intact against the onslaught of greed. "Come, Andrew," I said. "It's time for me to go back to my room." We walked upstairs, Daisy trailing behind us, her tail wagging as if she sensed the nightmare had broken. I stood at my bedroom door, my hand tightening on the knob. The verdict had been executed. This house was no longer a prison. It was a home again. My heart beat slow and steady. The treatment plan for this family had begun, and though the scars would remain, the patient was finally out of critical condition. The master bedroom door clicked shut. A soft, muffled seal of wood on wood, worlds away from the harsh, metallic clank of the storage room door downstairs. I stood motionless in the heart of the room. A few days ago, this air had been thick with the scent of possession and betrayal. Now, the space had reclaimed its quiet dignity. Sharon was gone, taking her toxicity and brittle vanity with her. In the next room, Andrew remained with Toby. He was likely wading through the psychological debris of the collapse, but I knew those tremors were the necessary first stage of healing. I approached the bed, the sanctuary of my life. Daisy was no longer sprawled across it. Andrew had bathed her with the medicated shampoo I prescribed, and now she lay curled on her own rug at the foot of the bed. She looked up, her golden eyes soft, her tail giving a single rhythmic thump against the floorboards, a silent welcome to the true mistress of the house. Slowly, I stripped the bed. I peeled away the old linens, heavy with pet dander and the invisible spores of Sharon's schemes. In their place, I laid out fresh white linen, smelling of sunlight and lavender, retrieved from the depths of the oak armoire. My movements were deliberate and precise, the same way I used to dress deep wounds in the surgical ward. In medicine, sanitizing the environment is the first and most critical step. If you don't remove the irritant at the root, the body remains in a permanent state of alarm. As I smoothed the final corner of the sheet, I sat on the edge. For the first time in months, I drew a breath that reached the very bottom of my lungs. The air no longer tasted of industrial laundry chemicals or the sharp itch of animal epithelium. My bronchioles dilated fully. There were no more faint wheezes, no more paroxysmal spasms. As a nurse, I could feel my immune system standing down. The fight or flight reflex was finally surrendering to homeostasis. I lay back, feeling the honest weight of my body sink into the memory foam. I looked up at the ceiling, where George and I used to count the flickers of passing headlights during our sleepless nights. Freedom was no longer an abstract concept. I felt it in my neurons as they uncurled, finally released from the long suppression of cortisol. With the pressure lifted, my brain began its own repair. Clarity washed over me, a sharpness no longer needed for survival, but for savoring. I placed a hand on my chest, monitoring the rhythm. 65 beats per minute. A perfect resting cadence. I remembered the damp closet, the sugar-laden meals, the pale blue sedatives, masked as vitamins. They were all designed to erode me from the inside out, but they had failed against something Sharon could never quantify: dignity. Through decades of nursing, I had seen patients slip away simply because they felt they no longer had value. When dignity is wounded, the immune system seems to follow. I didn't survive just on smuggled omega-3 seconds or vitamin B12. I survived because I refused to blink. Dignity is the ultimate human immune system, a protective membrane for the soul against the toxins of humiliation. If I had accepted the senile label Sharon tried to pin on me, my cells would have aged and withered according to her script. But I chose to stand. I saved myself, and more importantly, I saved Andrew. My son had been a patient of severe psychological manipulation, a man who had lost the ability to distinguish love from exploitation. The brutal surgery I performed at the dinner table had excised the malignancy. He would have to learn to walk on his own feet again, without the artificial numbness of submission, but at least he was back in the realm of truth. As the night deepened, the house settled into an absolute, sacred silence. The roar of the washing machine below had been dead for hours, no longer a mechanical reminder of my demotion. I reached out and brushed the empty pillow where George once lay. I wasn't lonely. I felt his presence in the renewed integrity of these walls. "I'm home, George," I whispered into the dark. Recovery is a long-haul journey. I knew that tomorrow I would still face the hemorrhaging bank accounts, the delicate repair of Toby's trust, and Andrew's lingering shame. But those were mere surface symptoms compared to the soul cancer we had just escaped. In the liminal space before sleep, I thought of other women, those being pushed into storage rooms of their own making or others' choosing. I wanted to tell them, do not wait for someone to hand you back your dignity. Dignity is something you own, not something that is granted. Hold on to it with your intellect, with your alertness, and, if necessary, with the fierce resolve of a nurse protecting a life. I closed my eyes. My neurons were no longer strained to record, to guard, or to calculate countermoves. They shifted into the quiet work of weaving beautiful dreams. In them, I wasn't frail. I was standing in a sun-drenched hospital corridor, my hands steady and clean, ready for whatever the next shift brought. This house, this bed, and this breath of free air, everything had returned to its proper orbit. I hadn't just reclaimed a room. I had reclaimed the right to be myself until the very last breath. Sleep came to me like a gentle, sweet anesthetic, free of chemicals. I lay there, peaceful and proud, in my sanctuary, shielded by truth and self-respect. Everything was stable. The world was finally healing. Life isn't always a successful emergency code, but every one of us has the right to be the chief surgeon of our own fate. When you refuse to let yourself be infected by mistreatment, you've already won half the war. Remember, a true home isn't found in the walls, but in the place where you can breathe deep and sleep soundly, without shame,